Editorial y librería Herder presenta Eduardo Khon, pensando y hablando con los bosques, a cargo de Rose-Marie Mariaca Fellmann, psicoanalista y directora de la colección Psicoanálisis 22 del editorial.
De acuerdo a algunos comentarios que recibí sobre la anterior presentación, el pensamiento silvestre, hubo una coincidencia en sus comentarios que fue las ganas, el interés en saber más sobre semiótica, en saber más sobre signos, la manera como funcionan. Y la semiótica no es tan complicada, pero hay que leer. Y sobre todo a Peirce, que es el autor que Eduardo Khon retoma en su libro, y esta lectura es inevitable. Quiero recordarles que Eduardo Khon no es psicoanalista, él retoma la semiótica desde la antropología. En esta ocasión, entonces, debido a sus comentarios, vamos a presentar una entrevista que le hacen en el 2018, donde habla un poco sobre los signos, una especie de pequeña introducción, y sobre la manera de pensar, tema complejo, y finalmente lo que más interesa, la manera de pensar. Se llama Sylvain, pensando y hablando con los bosques. Un lugar donde las ausencias adquieren mucha más importancia que las presencias. Es una entrevista en inglés con una traducción de YouTube automática, de manera que no es muy buena, pero más vale eso a nada. Lo que les recomiendo es que mejor escuchen si es que lo pueden hacer.
I think that, yes, humans can speak to forests and forests can speak back. The question is, what does it mean to speak? What does it mean to listen? My book was an attempt to give one kind of an answer, to say that there is a kind of thought available to us that just doesn't quite look like the thought that we usually think of as thought. My book, How Forests Think, is based on ethnographic research. I'm an anthropologist in the Amazon, in an area that was in the Ecuadorian Amazon, living with indigenous people and doing ethnography with them. That is, spending a lot of time hanging out and attending to what I learned from that hanging out and trying to represent that as best I can through writing and other practices. So what I quickly realized when I was doing ethnography with these people is that it wasn't enough to sort of attend to what the people were doing, but they had to recognize that they were relating to all sorts of other beings. Some of them were visible, like animals and plants, and some of them were not so visible, like spirits. And all of these beings were part of the forest. And I tried to very carefully follow how that relationship took place. And I realized that the best way to understand that was through understanding these relationships as communicative ones. So people obviously talk among each other and they use language. They obviously, another way to say is that people think, right? They represent the world around them. They learn from that experience. What's interesting about my ethnographic work is that once you do ethnography with how people think or represent with each other, but also with others, animals, plants, and also spirits, then you're in another kind of domain of thought. And a lot of my work was about just following that, often through things like tape recording. How is it that people talk amongst each other about forest experiences, and then what happens when some of those forest experiences intrude. So sometimes people will be having certain conversations and a certain bird flies over, makes a call. That call is also part of the recording I made, and it's a form of communication that people interpret in different ways, and how they interpret it is sometimes like the way the bird communicates, sometimes unlike. So I began to realize that this was a huge problem in our way of thinking, Western ways of thinking, academic ways of thinking about things. And I decided to say that, you know, the most important claim, it could be summarized in this idea that forests also think, that is, other kinds of entities think, not just humans. So that would be individuals, like you could say an individual agouti or a jaguar thinks, a plant thinks, but maybe assemblages of entities, which we might call a forest, thinks, and maybe even something more general like spirits think. I use Sylvan thinking as a way to talk about those kinds of thinking that are not necessarily symbol-like. And so when we represent through images, like filming, when we draw, when we dream, when we gesture, when we read emotions, our metabolism, all of those forms of being are partaking they're representational, they're parts of living thinking, as you were saying, but they're not necessarily symbolic. Sylvan thinking sort of amps up or makes apparent these elements of thought that I would like to valorize. So Sylvan thinking amps up the property inherent to all thinking of working through images. So what's interesting about images, likenesses, is that they have a certain kind of relational property. So for example, if you laugh and I laugh because you're laughing, your laughter is in me, but it's actually not your laughter anymore, it's my laughter. We are one because of that laughter, right? We know this, I mean, that's the essence of all sorts of forms of bonding in human groups. We tend to think that telos, purposes, functions are things that we impose, wherever that mind came from, we don't know, but that we impose on the world. And what's interesting about understanding life as semiotic is you can see the emergence of directedness and like means-ends relationships. And yet, this is not a grand teleology. It's not clear. There's no sense of where it's going. It's going, but it's not clear where it's going. It's not predetermined. And one of the reasons why that is that part of what people sometimes miss is the specific spaces of disruption of means-ends relationships, where that is part of the flourishing. And this is play. So that's one of the, that's why play for me is so important. You can see this, I work in tropical forests. In a sense, all of that production of variation is a one massive playing field. It's one great production of different thoughts about the world. Universities are like this too.
Try stuff out.
Try stuff out.
Sticks.
See what sticks.
Sort
Yeah, exactly. Try stuff out. See what sticks, and you never know what it's going to stick to, right? Because the world changes. Part of what I'm interested in is looking at ways in which that dualism is disrupted, and one of the ways to look at that is to look at things like semiotic life and representation as essentially a moment where in the universe where absences become more important than presences. So, you know, an organism is not the environment that it represents, right? We who are alive are indebted to our ancestors who are dead, who are not here. We do things, you know, by virtue of future goals that are not present. All of this sort of absential phenomena is super important. And I think that a lot of the things that when we talk about domains that are religious or divine or God, spirits, they are amping up to this kind of absential dynamics. These living dynamics produce generalities. Semiotic life produces things that we normally locate only in human minds. Forests create generalities. Living forms create generalities. A species, a lineage. The locus of evolution is not at the individual, it's in some other slightly larger domain. Those are generals. Spirits are generals. I think once you can reground symbolic thinking, which is not to kill it or to stop our particular form of flourishing, but once you can reground it, then I think that can help us live in a way that we're less disjointed from the effects we have in the world. That's one thing. The other thing is that I think that Sylvan thinking can suggest its own form of doing and being. It suggests another way of acting. So what is it like to live in a more absential way? Which is, I guess, it could also be thought of as a Buddhist question. What's that like? I think that those are things that can be actively thought about by thinking with thinking forests. So thinking forest is not just something that is an object to be preserved, but it's a form of being to relate with in order to learn another form of relating.